Imagine a quiet gallery somewhere in London or New York or Berlin. White walls, polished floor, the low shuffle of visitors trying not to make too much noise with their shoes. In the center of the room, under glass, sits an object that most people walk past without really seeing. It isn't a statue, it isn't gold, it isn't covered in jewels. It's a small, slightly crooked slab of baked clay, the color of dried river mud. One corner is chipped, a faint thumbprint dents the back. Up close, though, its surface is crowded with tiny wedge-shaped marks, pressed in straight horizontal lines from one edge to the other. It looks like some kind of code, or the track of a very careful insect that walked back and forth. This is cuneiform, one of the first writing systems human beings ever used. And somewhere on tablets like this, written thousands of years ago in a language that went silent for millennia, a word appears that has become strangely famous in our time: Anunnaki. If you only know that word from late-night television or certain corners of the internet, it probably comes wrapped in a very particular story. In that story, the Anunnaki are mysterious visitors from space, arriving in shining machines, engineering the human race to mine gold, ruling us as gods, and disappearing into the sky with a promise to return. It is a story full of dramatic music, zoomed-in photos of ancient ruins, and sentences that begin with "what if," followed by a long pause. The clay tablet under the glass tells a different story. It doesn't show rockets. It doesn't mention planets with strange orbits. It doesn't record secret genetic experiments. It lists offerings or hymns or legal phrases. It speaks about gods and cities and fields and canals in a way that is alien and familiar at the same time. To understand who the Anunnaki really were, for the people who wrote these tablets, we have to leave the museum for a while. We need to go back to the land where that clay was once wet, where reeds grew thick along the water's edge, and where the sky was a white, burning bowl all summer long. We need to stand, at least in imagination, in ancient Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, 4,000 or 5,000 years before our own century. From above, that land is not dramatic. No mountains, no forests, just a wide, flat plain running down toward the sea. Two long brown rivers twist their way through it like loose cords. But if you float lower, you begin to see the pattern that mattered most. The rivers are veined with side channels and canals, drawn out like irrigation lines across the dust. Fields appear as rectangles of green between strips of dry ground. Mud brick villages sit on small rises just high enough to escape the worst floods. Narrow boats move slowly along the water, pushed by poles or pulled with ropes from the bank. Men in simple kilts carry baskets of earth in long chains, building up levees and platforms. Women grind barley on low stones. Children chase goats along the edge of the irrigated land, where the green gives way to raw, hard soil. Nothing about this place is easy. These people live on the edge of a bargain with nature that can fail at any time. It almost never rains enough here to grow crops just from rainfall. If you want to eat, you have to lead the rivers to your fields by hand. You cut channels, you dig ditches, you build embankments, you measure slopes by eye and by experience. Too much water and your levee breaks, your field turns to a swamp, your house collapses. Too little and your crops shrivel, your animals starve, your children go hungry. The land is generous when the system works and absolutely ruthless when it doesn't. So this is a landscape that trains people very early to think about order. You cannot survive on your own little island. Water won't cooperate with private plans. Your canal depends on what your neighbor upstream does. Your field depends on somebody making sure the main channel is dredged at the right time of year. If an official falls asleep on his duties, or takes bribes and ignores his work, hundreds of families can lose their harvest. You need schedules, rules, agreements. You need somebody to say, on this day the canal will be opened, on this day it will be closed. You need a calendar that tells you when to plant and when to cut. You need laws that say who owns which strip of land and what happens if somebody quietly moves a boundary stone to steal more water. In other words, you need a system, not just a political system, not just a religious system, not just an economic system. All of those things are tangled together here. The people of these first cities built that system out of the things they had at hand: stories, rituals, simple tools, and enormous patience. And as the system grew more complicated, they invented something new to hold it together: writing. The first writing, as far as we can see from the evidence, did not emerge to record poetry or philosophy. It emerged to keep track of grain, rations, land, and labor. A land of canals and barley needed receipts. Someone would press a reed stylus into soft clay to mark how much grain had been paid to a worker, or how many jars of beer had been sent to a temple kitchen. Once those marks hardened, they became a memory outside the mind, a promise that could be checked, a story that could be challenged or confirmed. Day after day, generation after generation, these little clay memories built up into archives, shelves of tablets in the back rooms of temples and palaces, long before anyone dreamed that people in another age would be leaning over them in glass cases half a world away. But numbers, once you have them, invite words. A mark that stands for barley can share space with a mark that stands for a god's name. A tablet that begins as a list of rations can end with a short prayer. Slowly, patiently, scribes learned to put down not just 10 measures of grain, but a hymn to the Lord of the wind, or a curse on anyone who alters this grant of land. The stories that people had been telling around firelight or on the temple steps began to enter the clay. Those stories answer questions that any society has to answer. Where did the world come from? Who rules it? Why are some cities strong and others weak? Why do we have to work so hard? Why do people die? What happens after? In the world of the first cities, the characters in those stories are gods. They are not perfect. They argue, they make mistakes, they change their minds, but they are also the only beings powerful enough to turn a flood into a punishment, or a good harvest into a sign of favor. And at the very top of their society, above the local gods of specific temples and fields, there is a higher circle, a kind of divine royal family and council combined. That circle is what the ancient texts call the Anunnaki. For a Sumerian farmer, the word Anunnaki would not have meant aliens or ancient astronauts. It would have meant something closer to the great gods or the princely seed of heaven and earth. These are the eldest and most important powers, children of the sky and the earth, the ones who were there before cities rose. And the high sky gives the sense of distant, unreachable authority. Enlil, the lord of wind and command, is the one whose decisions fate and kings listen to. Enki, lord of sweet underground water and cleverness, lives where fresh water springs up from under the ground near the sea, and is often the one who finds a way around rigid rules. Inanna, fierce and radiant, governs love, war, and everything that happens when desire and ambition get mixed together. There are others. The sun god, who sees everything by day. The moon god, who sets time by night. Gods of storms, plagues, fields, and more. Together, the most senior of these form the Anunnaki, a council that can sit in judgment, hand out gifts, or withdraw support. If you try to picture them, don't imagine them as disembodied forces floating in space. Imagine a very old, very serious council chamber with massive carved chairs and tall figures seated in a row, each wearing a horned crown, horns stacked in layers like a stylized crown of power. They are not kind in the way we might wish them to be, but they care about stability. They care that the seasons keep turning, that cities maintain their temples, that canals are kept in order, that oaths are kept. In mythic scenes, when something big needs to be decided, whether to destroy humanity with a flood, whether to assign kingship to one city or another, it is the Anunnaki who assemble, listen, and pronounce. Behind that image lies a very human habit, taking the complicated reality of how decisions actually get made, conversations between priests, arguments in council, pressure from families and neighbors, and lifting it into the sky, giving it a set of divine faces. For people who lived in houses of mud brick and feared the river every spring, it was comforting to think that beyond the palace and the temple courtyard, beyond the horizon of their own town, there was an ultimate court whose decisions were not accidental and not easily corrupted. If that court had chosen your city's god as a favorite, you might expect a run of good years. If that court turned away, you could explain disaster as something more than pure bad luck. The Anunnaki are also tied to a strange and important concept the Sumerians had, a little word that carries a big idea: me. It looks simple when we write it in Latin letters, just 2 characters, but in their thought, the me are the deep patterns that make civilization run. A me is not a tool you can hold in your hand. It is more like a power or a function. There is a me of kingship, the authority to rule, the rituals around the throne, the expectation that people will fall in line at the right moments. There is a me of truth, of music, of weaving, of wisdom. There are me for crafts, for justice, for the art of writing, and even for less flattering things like rivalry and panic. Every major feature of life in a city has its own me, its own divine blueprint. One famous story describes these powers as if they were curiosities you could actually load into a boat. In this story, the goddess Inanna, patron of Uruk, wants her city to be the most complete, the most advanced, the center of everything. She knows that Enki, down in old Eridu by the marshes, holds the me. So she goes to visit him. There is a feast, there is a lot of beer. Enki, pleased and drunk, begins handing over the me one by one as gifts. Me of kingship, me of music, me of wisdom, me of truth, me of crafts, me of victory, me of priesthood, me of lamentation. He pours them into her boat, blessing Uruk with each one. Eventually he passes out. Inanna wastes no time. She orders her boatmen to push off and head for Uruk at once. When Enki wakes up and realizes what he has done, he panics. He sends his servants, monstrous creatures and forces of the water, to chase down the boat and take the me back. But his attempts fail. The boat reaches Uruk, the powers are unloaded, and from then on, Inanna's city has everything that makes a great city flourish. Temple rituals, music in the courts, skilled crafts, proper law, even the ability to argue and reconcile. This story is playful, even comic in places, but the underlying lesson is serious. Civilization, for the Sumerians, is not just something that happens because people gather together. It is a set of powers deliberately arranged and assigned. Someone, somewhere, has to decide who gets which me, which parts of culture belong in which place. Behind all that sits the Anunnaki, the high council that ultimately holds these powers and approves where they go. When a city rises, it is because, in cosmic terms, the Anunnaki have agreed to let its god carry the right me. When a city falls, it is because those powers have been withdrawn or reassigned. The same logic applies to the institution that sits at the center of their political world: kingship. On the human level, a king is a man with troops and wealth and a palace. On the mythic level, he is someone who has received a me from the gods, someone whose office descended from heaven. The Sumerian king list, a sober-looking document that marches through rulers and cities, opens with one crucial line. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The phrasing is deliberate. Kingship is treated almost like a sacred object, a role that can be placed here or there, granted and withdrawn. It moves from city to city as history changes, but it never stops being divine in origin. For ordinary people, this story cuts two ways. On one hand, it reinforces loyalty. If kingship itself is holy, then rebellion is not just a political risk, it is a crime against the order of the universe. On the other hand, it also limits kings. If your office was given, it can be taken away. If your city falls, poets will say that your god abandoned his or her temple and that the Anunnaki turned their backs on you. Power is not your personal property. It is a loan. Underneath all of this, under the canals and the calendars and the power games, lies the question of human work. The myths do not pretend that labor is easy. They do not romanticize it as some kind of spiritual hobby. They talk openly about sore shoulders, endless digging, the boredom of hauling basket after basket of clay. And in one story, they go so far as to admit that even gods can get tired of that. In the tale we now call Atrahasis, the world is already there. The sky has been separated from the earth. The great gods have shrines and authority, but the day-to-day maintenance of the cosmos is still being done by a class of junior deities. They are the ditch diggers of heaven, assigned to dredge canals, build levees, raise temple foundations, and keep the great works in order. For a very long time they accept this. Then, after years of thankless labor, something breaks. One night they throw down their tools and march as a group to the house of Enlil, the chief god. They surround his gates with torches. This is, in effect, a divine workers' strike. Enlil wants to crush them. He sees only disobedience. But the other senior gods realize that this is not just a discipline problem, it is a design problem. You cannot run the universe on the backs of a resentful, overworked class forever. They need another solution. In council, the Anunnaki decide on a radical answer. They will make a new kind of being to carry the heaviest tasks. The recipe is described in ritual, almost priestly language. They will mix clay, the same material that forms the riverbanks and the walls of houses, with something divine. In some versions, they choose a god whose name suggests intelligence and understanding. He is killed, and his blood is mixed with the clay, so that the new creature they make will not be a dumb animal, but a being who can understand commands, keep rituals, remember instructions, talk back to the gods in prayer. Birth goddesses mold this mixture into forms and place them into a kind of House of Wombs. After the right number of months, the first human beings are born. Their purpose is stated bluntly. They will carry the baskets. They will dredge the canals. They will maintain the temple estates, grind grain, brew beer, bake bread, build walls, sweep courtyards, and keep the physical and ritual house of the gods in order. In return, they will receive food, clothing, shelter, and protection. They will also receive something intangible but crucial, a place in the story. From now on, humans are the link between the divine and the earthly, the workers who keep the world running and the worshippers who feed the gods with offerings and songs. If you strip away the supernatural framing, this is a very direct way of talking about why life in the first cities was hard but meaningful. You work because without your work the canals silt up and the fields die. You also work because, in the logic of the myth, you were created for that purpose. Your labor is not meaningless. It participates in a cosmic contract. The gods decree and protect. You maintain and praise. This is the world in which the word Anunnaki was born. A world of mud and sunlight, of tired backs and careful schedules, of rulers who insist their right to govern comes from heaven, and of families who pour out beer at the graves of their dead, so that the shades in the dark won't go thirsty. It is not our world, but it is not as far from our concerns as the wildest modern theories about secret extraterrestrial rulers might suggest. It is about order, workload, justice, and limits. Once humans arrive in the story, the world becomes noisier and more complicated very quickly. At first, everything seems to work. The junior gods are relieved. The canals stay clear. Temples are busy. Smoke from offerings rises in thin white threads into the sky. People live in small numbers along the rivers, close enough to keep the channels in order. Not so many that anyone feels crowded. But if there is one thing humans are good at, it is multiplying and making more of whatever already exists, including trouble. In the Atrahasis story, time passes in mythic numbers. Generations follow one another until the land is thick with people. Fields spread. Villages grow into towns and towns into cities. Everywhere there is sound. Cattle lowing, hammers striking pegs, millstones grinding, babies crying, reed flutes playing in the evenings. To the people living it, this is simply life. To the gods looking down from their high halls, it starts to feel like a constant, irritating hum. One god in particular has less patience than the rest. Enlil, lord of command and wind, begins to complain that he cannot sleep. Night on earth is night in heaven as well, and the noise of humanity rises like the buzzing of insects. In some versions of the story, the text is almost funny in its dryness. The great god of air, annoyed like a tired neighbor who cannot stand another loud party in the apartment next door. But in a myth, annoyance from a god can very quickly turn deadly. Enlil is not just a powerful person with a short temper. He is part of the machinery that keeps the cosmos running. If he feels things have gone too far, he can call the council and propose drastic remedies. So he does. The Anunnaki assemble again, the high court of heaven sitting in what we might imagine as a hall lined with stone, its roof lit by a light not quite like ours. They do not start with the worst option. Their first answer to the human problems, not a flood but a plague. One of the gods of sickness is sent down to stalk the streets. People sicken and die. The noise drops. For a while, the gods enjoy their quiet. On the ground, however, life is horror. Families lose children, villages empty. The temple courtyards fill with the smell of incense and desperate prayers. In many modern stories, compassion would come from a human hero. In these Mesopotamian myths, it frequently comes from a god who has already shown a habit of bending rules. Enki, lord of wisdom and sweet waters. He looks at what is happening and decides the experiment has gone far enough. Enki cannot openly defy the decision of the council. That would break the order that makes him who he is. But he can send advice. In Atrahasis, he whispers to people, teaching them which god to appease and how. He suggests that they direct offerings to the plague bringer, giving him attention and food so that he will call off his attack and leave. The plan works. The plague lifts. The population recovers. The noise rises. Enlil, frustrated, calls the Anunnaki again. This time the punishment is famine. Rains fail. Canals run low. Barley fields stand thin and yellow. Again, Enki quietly helps humans adapt. Find new food sources. Change what you plant. Dig deeper for water. The pattern repeats. Punishment, survival, recovery, noise. Eventually, after lesser measures like drought and scarcity have all failed to permanently correct the problem of too many people making too much noise, Enlil proposes something final. The world needs to be washed clean. A flood will do what plagues and famines could not. It will sweep away houses and fields, erase roads and boundary stones, and push everything back toward the beginning. The Anunnaki agree. The oath they swear this time is stricter. They bind one another not to warn humans of what is coming. The decision is sealed in the High Council. The plan is to let the earth drown. The story pauses for a moment on the problem this creates for Enki. He is part of the council, bound by its oath. But he is also, by character, the god who cares about clever solutions, who has already risked bending decisions in order to preserve life. If he cannot directly tell people that a flood is coming, can he find a way to keep his promise and still help? This tension between strict order and compassionate cunning runs throughout Mesopotamian myth. The Anunnaki, as a group, represent the need for firm rules. Enki represents the way life constantly pushes up against those rules, searching for a humane path that doesn't break the whole system. His solution is a legalistic one and also a storyteller's delight. He chooses one man, a wise figure living in the city of Shuruppak. Different texts give him different names. Atrahasis, the very wise, in Akkadian, Ziusudra in Sumerian. Later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he appears under yet another name, Utnapishtim. Whoever he is the one human being Enki decides to save. But Enki cannot walk into his house and say, "Listen, a flood is coming, build a boat." That would violate the oath, so he speaks to the walls. This sounds odd to us, but it makes sense inside a world where speech has power and where boundaries between things are a little more porous. Enki stands outside the reed house and calls, reed wall, listen to me." He then gives instructions loud enough and clear enough that anyone inside can hear. Technically, he is keeping his promise. He is talking to the wall, not directly to a human. Practically, he is saving a life and a future. The instructions are precise. Tear down your house and use the materials to build a boat. Make it large enough to carry your family, your animals, and the seed of all living things. Seal every seam with bitumen so that no water can leak in. Do not waste time gathering your furniture. This is not about comfort. It is about survival. The text even mentions the hiring of workers, the paying of craftsmen, the burning of pitch. all things that any Riverland people would understand. This is not a magic ark that falls from the sky. It is the ultimate version of something Mesopotamians built every day, a reed and wood boat, with its hull made tight with black, sticky tar. When the boat is ready, the sky changes. Clouds pile on clouds. The wind rises. Rain begins with a violence that feels personal. The gods of storm and water do their work thoroughly. The rivers climb out of their beds, roar across their banks, and merge into a single moving sheet of brown water. Houses collapse. People climb onto rooftops, then are swept away. In some descriptions, the earth itself seems to crack and buckle under the force of the flood. The world as they know it is being erased. One of the most striking touches in these stories is what the flood does to the gods themselves. While the waters are rising, the Anunnaki are not calm. Some texts say they huddle like dogs at the edge of the sky, frightened by the very destruction they ordered. The images of divinity are not always majestic or heroic. They are often painfully human. A council that agreed to a harsh sentence now has to watch it play out, with consequences they did not fully foresee. Atrahasis, sealed in his boat with his family and cargo, rides out the storm. Dates are given in days and nights of chaos. Then finally the text says that the waters begin to sink. The boat grounds on a mountain or high place. Our survivor opens a hatch and lets light into the dark hold. He sends out birds to test whether there is dry land. A dove, a swallow, and finally a raven, which does not come back. This is his sign that the world is again solid enough to walk. What he does next is essential. He does not celebrate his own survival privately. He builds an altar. He offers a sacrifice of animals, burning them so that the smell of roasting meat rises into the clean air. The phrasing in the tablets is almost sharp with humor. The gods gather like flies around the smoke. During the flood, with humanity nearly wiped out, there were no offerings, no bread, no beer, no incense. The gods who had agreed so casually to get rid of their noisy workforce are suddenly hungry, literally and symbolically. This is the moment when Enlil realizes that someone has survived. He sees the smoke and flames, and his anger is enormous. Who told him? Who broke the oath? Again, Enki stands up. He does not deny what he has done. Instead, he makes an argument that sits at the heart of Mesopotamian thinking about fate and mercy. He says, in effect, we were wrong to choose absolute destruction. There are other ways to manage a crowded world than drowning it. What Enki proposes instead is not kindness in our modern sentimental sense. It is a hard, rational compromise. Human life will be limited. People will no longer live for hundreds and hundreds of years. Some roles in society, such as certain priestesses, will not bear children. Periods of infertility will occur. In some versions, he suggests demons or spirits that will take a fraction of infants so that the whole does not overwhelm the land. These details shift from tablet to tablet, but the core logic remains. Instead of wiping the slate clean every time humanity becomes too much, build limits into the system from the beginning. Mortality here is not presented simply as a punishment. It is presented as a necessary boundary. A world in which everyone lived forever and everyone could have as many children as they liked would collapse under its own weight. This is ecological thinking in mythic form. The Anunnaki, pressed by Enki, agree to the new terms. Humanity will continue, but within narrower lines. A single human Atrahasis or Utnapishtim is given a special reward, a long, unending life far away. But that exception only underlines the rule for everyone else. If you pause here and compare this to later flood stories and other traditions, the echoes are obvious. A boat, a chosen family, animals taken aboard, a global flood, birds sent out, an altar built afterwards, a new agreement about how divine judgment will work in future. But even if you didn't know any of those later versions, the Mesopotamian tale stands firmly on its own ground. It makes emotional sense in a land where rivers sometimes leave behind layers of clean clay meters thick, burying fields and houses. It also makes administrative sense in a culture obsessed with counting and balancing. The Anunnaki, in this phase of the story, are not distant creators. They are managers of a vast, fragile system who have just learned by experience that one form of control, total erasure, creates more problems than it solves. The flood changes the tone of religion in the centuries that follow. Texts from after this imaginary event often carry a sharper awareness of fragility. King lists divide history into before the flood and after the flood, with lifespans dropping from impossible numbers to more realistic reigns. Laments for destroyed cities echo the flood's language of overwhelming water and departing gods. Rituals of atonement and purification grow more elaborate, as if everyone knows that balance is precarious and must be constantly maintained. The Anunnaki are still the high council in the sky, but their relationship to human beings has shifted. It is less like a family dealing with their own household servants, and more like a court dealing with subjects who can push back. Humans now have a track record. They have survived plagues, famines, and the worst flood imaginable. They have multiplied again. They continue to dig canals, make offerings, raise walls, and write contracts. They are not easily erased. The stories turn to another question. If death is now the boundary that keeps life sustainable, who governs what happens beyond that line? Where do people go when they die? And who judges them then? In Mesopotamian imagination, the afterlife is neither paradise nor a place of constant torture. It is a dim, dusty world beneath the earth, often called simply the land of no return. The dead live there as shades, weak and thin. They eat dust unless their living relatives remember them with offerings. The gates to this realm are guarded. The path includes a river, a dark mirror of the bright rivers on the surface, with a boatman who ferries new arrivals across. This world has its own queen, Ereshkigal, and its own laws. It also has its own court. Some of the same gods who once sat in the bright council of heaven now appear in this lower court as judges. The title, Anunnaki, begins, over time, to shift. In older Sumerian texts, it points upward to the high family of gods. In later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are more often the powers who sit in judgment over the dead. The word does not change. Its address slowly migrates. A civilization that once focused on the sky as the main realm of divine order now spreads that order across both sky and underworld. One famous story brings us into that underworld and shows us the lower court at work. The goddess, Inanna, ambitious, curious, never content with only one domain, decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal below. She prepares carefully, putting on each symbol of her power: crown, jewelry, cloak, scepter. As she descends, she comes to 7 gates. At each gate she is told to remove one item. By the time she reaches the throne room, she is naked and stripped of all her signs of authority. There, in the deepest hall, sit 7 judges. Many texts call them Anunnaki. They do not debate with her, they do not flatter. They fix their gaze and pronounce a verdict of guilt. Inanna is struck down and her body hung on a hook, as lifeless as any corpse. Only a complicated rescue from the world above eventually restores her. And even then, a price must be paid. Someone has to go down in her place for the rules to remain intact. The point of this story is not that the gods are cruel for pleasure. It is that there are boundaries which even the most glamorous deity cannot cross without consequences. If you enter the land of the dead, you are subject to its law. The Anunnaki, as judges here, represent the continuity of order. The same principle that once separated sky from earth and assigned kingship to cities now keeps the dead where they belong, the living where they belong, and ensures that transitions between the two are not chaotic. For people living along the rivers, this picture of the afterlife shapes daily behavior. Families pour out water and beer for their ancestors on specific days of the month. They bring small amounts of food and speak the names of the dead. These acts are not private superstitions. They are part of a larger covenant. If you honor your dead, their shades remain calm and do not return to cause illness or disturbances. If you neglect them, they may become restless spirits. In serious cases, a priest can be called who will burn incense, recite incantations, and appeal to the Anunnaki of the underworld to take the wandering soul back into proper custody. The same underworld court appears in more public documents too. Boundary stones, inscribed pillars that mark the edges of fields and grants of land, often carry curses. It is not enough to say this line should not be crossed. The text adds teeth. May the Anunnaki of heaven and earth strike blind anyone who moves this stone. May they cut off his seed. May they turn his house into ruins. These are harsh wishes, but they emerge from a context where a small cheat on a boundary can deprive an entire family of water. To swear by the Anunnaki in such matters is to invoke the highest possible authority, both in this life and the next. You can see bit by bit how this idea of a senior court sitting behind all other courts helps hold a society together. City judges can be bribed or pressured. Kings can be foolish or cruel. But somewhere beyond them, in mythic space, is a set of powers who cannot be bought, who do not forget, and who keep a record of oaths and crimes. Whether this belief was always comforting is another question. It is certainly controlling. If you think the Anunnaki are watching, moving a field marker at night or breaking an oath in private becomes more dangerous than simply getting away with it. Meanwhile, the world above the earth is reorganizing itself politically and religiously. The older Sumerian city-states gradually give way to larger kingdoms. New dynasties rise with different dialects and different preferred gods. Babylon, in particular, grows from one more city on the plain into a capital whose name will live for centuries. When that happens, the stories of creation and power are rewritten in a way that keeps continuity but shifts emphasis. A newer god, Marduk, steps into a role once filled by older figures. The Anunnaki are still the assembly, but their seating chart changes. In the Babylonian creation epic, often called by its opening words, Enuma Elish, the cosmos begins with water. Fresh, underground Abzu and salty, surrounding Tiamat. From their mingling, gods arise, younger and younger. They quarrel. They make noise. Once again, an older power plans to silence them, and once again a champion steps forward to fight on behalf of the newer order. In the Sumerian world, such a champion might have been Ninurta or Enlil. In the Babylonian version, it is Marduk, the city god of Babylon. The story is vivid. Marduk receives weapons, proves his right to command by speaking a garment into disappearance and back again, and then faces Tiamat, depicted as a monstrous sea. He kills her, splits her body, and uses one half to form the sky, the other to shape the deep. He sets lights in their courses, organizes the calendar, fixes the stars as markers for time and ritual. Creation here is not a gentle blossoming. It is an act of violence followed by careful planning. When the older gods complain about their workload, Marduk offers the same solution we saw in Atrahasis, but with a twist. He will create humans from the blood of a rebel god named Kingu. Once again, human beings appear as a mixed creature, earthy, mortal, but carrying something of divine intelligence. Once again, their job is to relieve the gods of heavy labor, to maintain temples, fields, and city walls. The logic is familiar, but the politics have changed. Now it is Marduk who proposes and directs the process. Marduk who takes center stage as the organizer of both cosmos and society. The climax of Enuma Elish is not the creation of humans, though. It is the moment when the other gods, impressed by Marduk's victory and his planning, sit in assembly and grant him a long list of names and titles, 50 in all. Each name claims a function, one who establishes decrees, one who renews, one who brings life, one who restores cities after ruin, one who sets up the stars, one who tames the sea. It's as if Babylonian priests took the older catalog of me, those powers of civilization, and folded many of them into a single god. Where does that leave the Anunnaki? They do not disappear. Instead, they become, more than ever, a collective term for the senior gods who now, in many texts, sit under Marduk's chairmanship. Some later lists even divide them cleanly. 300 Anunnaki of heaven, 300 Anunnaki of earth and underworld. A neat symmetry that would have pleased any Babylonian accountant. In ritual, they still appear as a group to whom offerings are made and by whom decisions are confirmed. In myth, they are the chorus of elders ratifying a new center of power. Every spring in Babylon, this cosmic order was acted out in real time during a great New Year festival known as the Akitu. Statues of gods from various temples were carried in procession through the streets. Priests recited Enuma Elish aloud in the main temple of Marduk, the Asagala. The king himself underwent a striking ritual. He would enter the temple stripped of his regalia, be slapped by the high priest until tears came to his eyes, and only then receive his crown and scepter back. If he wept, it was a sign that he remained humble before the god. The year could then be renewed with confidence. For an ordinary person watching these processions, it must have been overwhelming. Bright glazed walls, enormous animal figures on the gates, the noise of drums, the sight of your king humbled before an invisible divine court. The Anunnaki were not just words on tablets. They were embodied in ceremonies that made the entire city the theater of a cosmic drama. The high council of gods and the very practical concerns of planting and taxation and justice were two faces of the same system. In all these changes, floods survived, new gods elevated, old names repurposed. The Anunnaki remain the thread that ties everything to the idea of order. First, they are the noble offspring of sky and earth, the original council that sets destinies. Then they become the senior assembly that approves kings and distributes powers like kingship and wisdom. Later, they become the grave judges below, ensuring that no oath and no life simply vanish without record. They are the constant reminder that behind every human decision there is a larger frame, a structure that people imagine as more durable and more just than anything they can build by hand. We, living far away in time and place, might not share their belief in these particular gods, but we still recognize the shape of what they were trying to do. We also want to believe that our work matters, that power is not just brute force that promises bind, that there is some kind of ledger where the story is kept fair. In the world of the first cities, the name for that hope was Anunnaki. When the flood stories settled into memory and the great cities rose again on the soft earth between the rivers, human life began to look more familiar to us. Crowded, ambitious, anxious, creative. People built new walls over old foundations, plowed fields where their grandparents once fished, and carved canals that fed both barley fields and political arguments. The world after the flood was not a rebirth of innocence. It was a world more aware of limits, more attentive to the ways fate could tilt suddenly. And because of this, the relationship between the divine council and humanity deepened into something more intricate, more like an ongoing negotiation than a single decree. In the rebuilt cities, every part of the landscape spoke of this balance. You could stand at dawn beside a canal at Ur and watch the sun catch the tips of reeds, while barges, loaded with grain, drifted downstream. You could walk through the thick gates of Lagash and hear the sharp tapping of chisels as scribes carved new laws into stone slabs. You could follow the long, dusty road to Nippur and see pilgrims carrying baskets of dates, flour, and oil, small tributes to present before the god whose temple marked the spiritual center of the land. These were not distant myths. They were daily life, lived inside a worldview that imagined divine oversight as the natural counterpart to human work. What is striking in the texts from this period is how consistently the gods and humans mirror one another. The divine realm is not a place of effortless perfection. It requires food, offerings, maintenance, festivals, and schedules, just like a city. And human society at its best behaves like a reflection of the cosmic council. Authority is legitimate only when it is tied to law and ritual. Work must be shared in measured ways. Decisions require witnesses. The early narratives where the Anunnaki struggle with noise and imbalance become patterns through which the cities understand themselves. A noisy city might anger a god, but a silent one is a dying one. The aim is not perfection, but harmony. In this world, writing becomes more than a tool. It becomes a kind of sacred technology. After the flood myth establishes that life depends on balance and accountability, writing offers the means to track both. At first, the marks on clay were simple tallies: sheep, barley, oil. But soon the system evolved into symbols for ideas, names, and eventually entire stories. Every tablet, however mundane, participates in the same logic. Human actions must be recorded, counted, and made legible to anyone with authority to interpret them. A contract about a barley loan and a hymn praising the fates set by the Anunnaki both rely on the same act: carving order into clay. Imagine a scribe in a courtyard, sitting cross-legged with a damp lump of clay on a board between his knees. He dips his reed stylus into the clay and presses wedge-shaped strokes in precise angles. He is not writing literature. He is copying accounts. 50 loaves for the temple, 7 jugs of beer for the priests, rations for canal workers. Behind him, boys recite lines aloud, learning the proper order of signs. Above him in the temple tower, priests chant hymns that describe how the high gods set the rhythm of the year. This is how the system works. Work, worship, record-keeping, ritual. The human and divine spheres interlock like gears. The stories of gods reflect these rhythms. Enlil, once the impatient lord who ordered storms, becomes in later texts the sober guarantor of kingship. His frown can depose a ruler. His smile can secure a dynasty. Enki, once the sly rescuer of humanity, becomes the patron of craft, writing, and clever solutions. Exactly what a city needs when its walls crack or its canals silt. Inanna, who once descended to the underworld, stripped of all status, becomes a driving force behind kingship, fertility, and the raw energy of ambition. The pantheon learns the same lesson humans learned after the flood. Power cannot rest in one hand. It must circulate. Cities expressed this circulation through ritual. Each month had festivals connected to the moon and the sun, but the largest festivals aligned the entire calendar with the cosmic order. During these ceremonies, statues of gods were carried through the streets. This was not entertainment. It was a literal enactment of the world view. Gods do not stay locked in their sanctuaries. They move through the city, possess it, renew its structure. When priests lifted a statue of Inanna and carried it to another district, the people lining the streets believed they were witnessing the goddess travel from her temple to visit her brother or consort in the next. These processions were moments when myth and geography overlapped perfectly. At the same time, people felt the constant vulnerability of their world. Rivers could overflow or shrink back unexpectedly. Trade routes could be disrupted by bandits or weather. Kings could rise promising justice and fall leaving ruin. To live in ancient Mesopotamia was to accept that life was precious precisely because it was precarious. This is why the afterlife, dim, dusty, controlled by a lower court, was not a place of terror, but of inevitability. Death was simply another border crossing, one that required ritual correctness. Families kept their dead close, burying them under houses or in courtyards. On fixed days of the month, they brought offerings of bread and beer. If a family neglected these duties, the dead might wander, causing illness or misfortune. Here again, the Anunnaki appeared, not as cosmic beings floating above the world, but as judges who kept order among the dead. When a shade misbehaved, priests could appeal to the underworld court to restore balance. Every level of society, from the palace to the smallest home, relied on these invisible courts to make life livable. And yet, despite this constant attention to order, chaos never entirely disappears. Stories begin to arise about heroes who push against limits, about kings who attempt impossible tasks, about mortals who seek what is reserved for gods. The most famous of these is Gilgamesh, the tireless king of Uruk. Though the earliest tales about him predate the flood version we know today, the full epic is shaped by the worldview that emerges in the aftermath. Gilgamesh's grief for his friend Enkidu becomes the grief of a world that knows death is now universal. His quest for immortality becomes a living expression of the new pact made after the flood. Humans must live within boundaries, not beyond them. When Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the story folds back on itself. Utnapishtim's tale repeats the earlier narrative. The noise of humanity, the council's decision, Enki's whisper, the great storm, the boat, the birds, the sacrifice. Hearing it, Gilgamesh hopes for an exception, a loophole, a way to escape the mortality imposed on all humans after the flood. Utnapishtim tells him that his own immortality was a one-time gift, never to be repeated. The story sends Gilgamesh home not defeated but wiser. He understands now that immortality is not the measure of greatness. The city is. The walls of Uruk, the ordered life of his people, the legacy he leaves behind, these are his share of eternity. This is the world view that flourished for centuries. A world where the divine and human courts reflect each other, where the work of irrigation and the work of fate flow together, where mortality makes meaning possible, where every brick, every loaf, every oath has weight. The Anunnaki remain present throughout this world, not always as characters and myths, but as the invisible backbone of the system, the imagined audience for every ritual and the silent witnesses to every promise. As time passes, the political map changes again. Great empires rise. Assyria with its enormous palaces and carved stone walls, Babylon with its immense processions and libraries. Kings expand the pantheon outward, absorbing foreign gods and giving them roles in the cosmic order. Yet the basic structure remains the same: a council of powers, a ledger of fate, a balance between sky, earth, and underworld. Assyria, fierce and disciplined, interprets the divine council through the lens of empire. Its kings march across continents, conquering cities and relocating entire populations. In their inscriptions, the gods go with them. Ashur, the state god, becomes the one who grants victory. The Anunnaki in this worldview are the magistrates who approve campaigns and keep track of treaties. Even here, where power seems absolute, the principle remains. Victories are not simply personal triumphs. They are cosmic decisions. In Babylon, the tone is different, less martial, more scholarly. Priests compile long lists of omens, tracking everything from the shape of clouds to the color of lamb livers. These are manuals for reading the world, based on the belief that the gods do not speak directly, but through patterns. A king who ignores the omens risks not only earthly disaster but cosmic disorder. The Anunnaki, imagined as the highest judges, are the ones who confirm or deny omen readings. In a sense, the entire science of divination is a dialogue with the unseen council. Meanwhile, foreign influences begin to blend into the mythology. Merchants travel to Anatolia, Syria, and along the coast of the Mediterranean, carrying not only goods but stories. Hittite myth picks up echoes of Sumerian tales about older and younger gods. West Semitic traditions absorb themes of the flood and the divine council, shaping them into new forms. The conversations between cultures are subtle and slow, but they reshape the edges of the Mesopotamian worldview. Through this exchange, the idea of a high council that governs the cosmos spreads widely, leaving traces in stories far beyond the rivers where it began. Throughout all these changes, one constant remains: the need to understand the unseen. People still stand under the wide sky at night and feel small. They still want to know why disasters happen, why kings rise and fall, why some seasons bring plenty and others bring ruin. The Anunnaki survive because they give shape to these questions. They turn chaos into a courtroom where decisions can be spoken, debated, amended. They give the sense that human life, however fragile, matters because it is witnessed. This sense shapes the final centuries of Mesopotamian civilization. Even as new empires rise, Persian, Greek, Roman, the old stories continue to echo. Libraries preserve hymns and creation tales. Priests chant ancient lines long after the political powers that first recited them have vanished. Ordinary people still trace the rhythm of months and festivals, still pour water for the dead, still speak oaths in the name of gods who once sat on the bright council of heaven. By the time these stories fade into the background of history, they have already left their mark. They have shaped ideas of law, kingship, ritual, justice. They have crossed into neighboring cultures and traveled far beyond their original borders. They have become part of the deep memory of the human world, and though the names will change, the structure they represent, a world where decisions matter, where work is sacred, where boundaries protect life, where a council holds the balance, will keep resurfacing again and again across centuries, in new languages and new shapes, waiting to be rediscovered each time someone looks at an ancient tablet and begins to read. In the centuries that followed, the land between the rivers entered one of the most intellectually fertile eras in human history. Cities rebuilt after the flood myths became centers of administration, astronomy, literature, and vast networks of exchange. But beneath all the noise of commerce, warfare, and court politics, the older framework remained intact. The quiet conviction that the cosmos was governed by intelligible forces, that the divine council still listened, and that human society had to keep its balance or risk unraveling. This subtle confidence shaped daily life as much as it shaped the poetry and inscriptions left behind. Across the plains, irrigation work continued as the heartbeat of the region. Generations of workers traced the same canals carved by their ancestors, repairing banks, widening ditches, guiding water to thirsty fields. A canal in Mesopotamia was never a passive landscape feature. It was an ongoing argument with gravity, sediment, drought, and the stubborn will of rivers that shifted their beds without warning. People believed the gods watched this work closely. When the levee broke or the fields flooded too early, entire communities gathered to ask what mistake had been made, whether an offering had been missed, whether a boundary had been crossed, whether a festival had been performed incorrectly. The unseen world and the physical world always mirrored each other with startling precision. Temples operated like the nerve centers of this system. They were not only places of ritual, but administrative hubs, where scribes recorded taxes, rations, land grants, and workforce assignments. Inside these temples, priests traced the months by the moon and aligned ceremonies to celestial motions. They believed the Anunnaki noticed whether cities kept their festivals on time because time itself was part of the cosmic contract. A month out of order meant more than scheduling trouble. It meant imbalance. An imbalance in a world so vulnerable to climate swings and foreign invasions could be fatal. The more you study this world, the clearer it becomes that mythology and bureaucracy were never opposites. They are the two hands of the same body. The stories gave meaning to the work, and the work gave stability to the stories. When a priest recited a hymn about Enlil setting destinies for kings, he was also preparing to present a petition to a governor or to check the year's rainfall measurements recorded in a temple archive. When a scribe read a creation myth in school, he knew that the clay tablet in his hand, listing barley or sheep, was part of that same story, because writing itself was a divine craft. And when a farmer stood under the stars at night, wondering whether a faint ring around the moon meant storms. He joined thousands of years of people looking for signs in a sky alive with intention. This merging of myth and administration also shaped their understanding of justice. Mesopotamian courts did not simply hear cases, they enacted a worldview where human oath-taking echoed the decrees believed to be spoken in the heavens. When two landowners disputed a boundary, they brought forward their tablets, their witnesses, and sometimes their gods. A simple boundary stone carved with curses was more than a marker. It was a promise bound to the authority of the Anunnaki themselves. If someone shifted that stone, they were not merely stealing land, they were violating the cosmic record. And in a culture where the dead still needed offerings and the gods weighed every vow, that was a dangerous act indeed. This sense of cosmic accountability influenced how rulers behaved. A king celebrated victories, but he also feared the day the gods might withdraw their favor. If crops failed or omens turned dark, a king could lose legitimacy overnight. Poets would say the city's patron god had left the temple, a polite formula for political collapse. Entire dynasties rose and fell based on a mixture of practical administration and symbolic balance. A ruler had to rebuild canals, protect trade routes, and keep soldiers fed, but he also had to keep the festivals on time, honor ancient shrines, and secure the favor of the High Council. Power was always conditional. The Anunnaki were always watching. Even as regimes changed, the intellectual life of the region flourished. Scholars in Babylon and Assyria developed detailed astronomical records, carefully tracking the motions of planets, eclipses, comets, and stars. This was not superstition, but a meticulous science, blended with ritual. They believed that celestial events were communications from a structured cosmos governed by the divine council. When Jupiter rose bright in the east, they saw not only a planet but a sign linked to Marduk, whose authority echoed that of older sky gods. Their observations filled entire libraries with clay tablets, ephemerides listing astronomical cycles, omen series predicting outcomes, catalogs of star names, and mathematical tables used to predict future events. The night sky became a ledger as precise as their ration lists. As these intellectual traditions deepened, something else emerged, a sense of historical consciousness. People began to see themselves as inheritors of immense cycles, floods, dynasties, migrations, restorations. They recorded kings in lists reaching back before memory, linking their present moment to an order older than any one city. A king might boast of a conquest, but he also carved lines saying he was restoring ancient rites or renewing temples built by long-dead rulers. A temple rebuilt was not simply a structure renewed. It was the renewal of a relationship with the unseen world, a reaffirmation of cosmic equilibrium. Meanwhile, ordinary families lived lives full of practical concerns: grain storage, marriages, sickness, repairs to mud brick homes, disputes with neighbors. Yet even these everyday actions rested on the larger cosmology. When a child was born, midwives whispered old prayers. When someone fell ill, healers recited incantations linking the sickness to disruptions that could be corrected by ritual or herbs. When a family buried a loved one beneath their floor, they placed small vessels or figurines alongside the body to maintain bonds with the underworld court. Nothing in this world was untouched by the deeper belief in a structured universe overseen by the Anunnaki. Travel through the region became a kind of pilgrimage of ideas. Traders moving along the Euphrates carried not only goods but myths, legal principles, and omen lore. When they arrived in far-off cities, Anatolia, the Levant, even Egypt, foreign scribes absorbed the stories and refashioned them in their own traditions. The flood story crossed languages. The divine council model influenced neighboring pantheons. The idea of cosmic tablets of destiny appears in multiple cultures after this period. The worldview was contagious because it was coherent. It made sense of uncertainty, gave stability to daily work, and bound communities together under a shared cosmic framework. In this period, literature blossomed into forms that still feel surprisingly modern. Priests composed laments for ruined cities, poems that captured the ache of loss with astonishing clarity. These laments do not picture the gods as abandoning humanity permanently. Instead, they portray a world temporarily out of balance, walls fallen, fields empty, enemies triumphant, while the poets cry out for restoration. And when restoration finally came, the festivals were not only celebrations of a rebuilt city, but acknowledgments that order had returned. The divine council was imagined as having forgiven the imbalance and allowed the rhythm of life to resume. The kings who ruled these cities often saw themselves as caretakers of this rhythm. Their inscriptions were less about personal glory than about continuity. They boasted of digging canals, restoring temples, building walls, and ensuring justice. These acts mattered because they were mirrors of cosmic acts. When a king straightened a canal, he echoed Enki organizing the waters at the beginning of time. When he judged a case fairly, he mirrored the decisions of the Anunnaki in the high court. When he led a festival procession, he anchored the city in the cosmic calendar. Even war was ritualized. Before campaigns, kings sought omens and offered sacrifices, acknowledging that victory belonged not simply to armies but to the divine order. This belief system did not eliminate suffering or injustice, but it gave people a language to cope with them. When loss struck, families framed it within the rhythms of myth. When famine came, communities described it as a sign of imbalance that could be corrected. When cities fell, their survivors composed laments addressed to the gods, believing that naming the destruction was the first step toward renewal. Myth became a form of resilience, enabling communities to endure the cycles of war, drought, and political turmoil that shaped Mesopotamia. And beneath all of this, the idea of the Anunnaki continued to evolve. They were no longer only sky gods or earth judges. They had become symbols of order itself, embodied principles of justice, fate, law, and cosmic stability. Their names lingered in contracts, hymns, curses, and blessings. Their presence hovered in the spaces between legal decisions and ritual offerings. They were not distant, otherworldly beings, but part of the architecture of meaning that held society together. As centuries passed and foreign powers conquered the region, the stories shifted but never disappeared. New dynasties brought new gods, but the old framework remained visible beneath the surface. Even when the names changed, the structure of the divine council endured. When Persians, Greeks, and later Romans entered Mesopotamia, they found a culture already deeply committed to the idea that the cosmos was lawful, that time was measurable, and that human actions mattered because they were witnessed by unseen authorities. By the time these stories reached the edges of the ancient Mediterranean world, they had become part of a vast web of ideas about justice, creation, and cosmic order. The people who lived along the rivers had formed one of the earliest, most enduring models of how humans fit into the universe. And this model would echo long after their cities fell silent, carried forward not only by ruins and tablets, but by the deep impressions left on cultures yet to come. As the centuries deepened and empires rose like tides over the wide plains of Mesopotamia, the framework woven by those early city builders did not vanish. It settled into the bones of daily life, into the rhythms of work and worship, into the quiet habits that shaped how whole populations understood themselves. Even as rulers changed, as armies passed through burning and rebuilding, as languages shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic, the old world view endured. It whispered through rituals, guided the hand of every scribe, and lingered in the carved lines of stone and clay. To live in this world was to move through layers of meaning so old that no one needed to explain them anymore. The idea that life unfolded within a cosmic architecture, measured, intentional, structured, gave people a sense of place in a land where fortune often felt fragile. A farmer rising at dawn saw more than the sun. He saw the renewal of a cycle governed by celestial watchers. Each lunar month was marked not only by the moon's phases, but by ceremonies that aligned the visible sky with the unseen court of the Anunnaki. When the new crescent appeared, priests lit lamps and whispered ancient words that carried through generations. A child growing up in this city would hear these phrases long before he understood their meaning. They were simply the sound of the world working. Inside the temples, which were part sanctuary, part treasury, part archive, scribes kept their styluses ready to record everything that mattered. They wrote down the grain harvested from each field, the day laborers assigned to canal repair, the deliveries from merchants, the offerings to each deity. Their records formed the memory of the city, thousands upon thousands of tablets stacked in storerooms, preserving not only facts, but the world view behind the facts. A tablet listing sheep given to the temple was also a declaration that the rituals supported order. A tablet recording a land boundary was also a silent invocation of the underworld judges, who guaranteed that promises mattered. Every line in those tablets was anchored to an idea much larger than bureaucracy, the belief that the universe responded to human truthfulness and discipline. Festivals brought this hidden architecture into dazzling visibility. Entire cities turned into stages for cosmic drama. When the new year approached, households scrubbed their floors and prepared offerings, and streets filled with color and anticipation. Statues representing the gods were carried from temples in golden boats, mounted on carts, escorted by priests, chanting hymns older than memory. People watched from rooftops as the procession wound through the city like a river of devotion. Children were told that the gods were meeting to decide the fate of the coming year. Whether the rivers would flood, whether the harvest would prosper, whether the city's enemies would stay at bay. In those moments, even the youngest understood that their lives hung between human activity and divine deliberation. War, too, reflected this dual perspective. Kings didn't march to battle without reading omens. Before the army set out, priests examined the liver of a sacrificial animal, believing its markings reflected the will of the divine council. Soldiers were not just fighters, they were instruments of cosmic order or chaos, depending on the god's verdict. A favorable sign could lift the morale of thousands. A dark omen could make an entire army hesitate. Victory was celebrated not only for strategic skill, but as confirmation that the gods deemed the king worthy. Defeat, likewise, was not simply a military failure. It was a sign the balance had been lost, that the divine court had turned its face away. In this world, time had texture. Months were not empty containers, but living intervals shaped by rituals, fasts, offerings, and taboos. Annual cycles marked the rise and retreat of rivers, the hardening of soil, the return of migratory birds, the swelling of reeds along canals. People saw patterns that bound them to their ancestors and to the invisible administrators of fate. A weaver spinning thread could pause and recite a prayer learned from her mother, who learned it from hers, until the line stretched back beyond memory. In a world where sickness struck unpredictably and drought could undo a year's labor in an afternoon, these rituals gave families courage. They believed that even in hardship, the world was not ungoverned. This belief also shaped how communities handled grief. Death was not an end so much as a transition into a dim but structured realm. Families buried their loved ones with lamps, bowls, beads, and a few simple possessions. They visited the grave with offerings on set days each month. These were not empty gestures. They were conversations between the living and the dead, reaffirmations that the bonds of kinship endured beyond the grave. When families poured water or beer for their ancestors, they believed the shades drank, and in quiet moments they believed the ancestors listened. To ignore these rites was dangerous. An uncared-for ghost might wander and trouble a household. Beneath all these practices was the old conviction that the Anunnaki presided over the underworld court, ensuring that even in death, justice persisted. Trade caravans stretched across deserts and mountains, carrying not only goods but ideas. Merchants from distant lands learned the stories of the Mesopotamian gods and brought fragments of them back to their own cultures. The story of a great flood appeared in new languages. The notion of fate written on tablets surfaced in foreign myths. Even the idea of a divine council, elders gathered to deliberate, migrated far from its birthplace. Yet these ideas never traveled as abstractions. They traveled as living memories carried by people who lit lamps at night and whispered prayers to unseen judges. In the courts, judges presided over disputes with a solemnity that came from knowing they acted in the shadow of much higher courts. Legal decisions were not only civic matters, they were spiritual ones. When a man accused his neighbor of moving a boundary stone, the trial invoked not only evidence but divine witnesses. A verdict affirmed that the community still believed in order. If corruption crept in, if judges were swayed by bribes, poets wrote laments accusing the gods of abandoning the city. Justice was more fragile than brick. It depended on a shared belief that truth mattered because the universe listened. Rulers understood this fragility better than anyone. Their inscriptions often acknowledge their responsibilities with a humility that surprises modern readers. A king might describe himself as shepherd of the people, a title that emphasized care over domination. He boasted not only of conquests but of restoring temples, resetting weights and measures, and ensuring fairness in marketplaces. His legitimacy rested not just on military strength but on his ability to maintain harmony between the human world and the cosmic order. A king who neglected festivals or oppressed the poor risked losing not only his throne but his city's blessing. Scribes preserved everything: the laws, the myths, the prayers, the victories, the failures. In many ways, They were the true architects of civilization. Their tablets preserved the intellectual map of a world where the divine and human converged. A scribe reading an omen text was not escaping into superstition. He was participating in a tradition that expected the universe to communicate. A scribe copying an epic was not merely preserving a story, he was ensuring that the next generation would understand why their world worked as it did. In their hands, clay became a bridge between centuries. Even the landscape itself participated in this worldview. The shifting rivers served as reminders that stability required constant vigilance. Every canal repaired, every wall rebuilt, every field replanted, echoed the stories of gods who fought chaos and restored balance. Floods reminded people that the cosmos could tilt. Rebuilding reminded them that order could be restored through communal effort and divine favor. The rivers did not merely water fields, they taught lessons. Above all, the worldview endured because it worked. It helped people cooperate in cities large enough to require shared values. It explained suffering without surrendering to despair. It bound communities with rituals that made the invisible feel present, and it gave generations a way to understand themselves inside a universe that felt alive and attentive. By the time these ideas traveled into later civilizations, into the tablets of Assyria, the hymns of Babylon, the stories of the Levant, they had become the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. Their influence spread like the branching canals of the rivers that nurtured them. Even when the names changed, even when new gods rose, the core remained. A belief in order, in responsibility, in memory, in justice, and in the unseen authorities that guaranteed the world's fragile equilibrium. Through every transformation, one conviction persisted: that life, for all its unpredictability, flowed inside a cosmic structure shaped by ancient hands, watched over by a council whose decisions echoed across generations. And as long as people continued to write, to build, to swear oaths, to bury their dead with care, and to rebuild after ruin, the Anunnaki remained alive in the architecture of human meaning. Across the long arc of Mesopotamian history, the relationship between people and their gods grew more intricate, more emotionally charged, and more deeply woven into every corner of civic and personal life. As centuries layered themselves like silt along the rivers, the worldview that began in the earliest cities matured into a complex emotional universe where duty, awe, fear, hope, and gratitude guided how people lived. This was not a civilization drifting through myth without question. It was a society that asked constantly what it meant to live well in a world shaped by forces greater than any single life. Daily existence unfolded under the quiet assumption that the divine was never far away. A merchant weighing barley in a busy marketplace felt that Shamash, the sun god, watched every transaction. A mother sending her son to deliver bread to the temple believed that unseen guardians walked beside him. A fisherman casting his net at dawn thanked the river spirit who allowed fish to return each season. Even the humblest act, tending goats, preparing clay, sweeping dust from a doorstep, echoed the cosmic balance celebrated in hymns. Nothing was too small to carry sacred weight. This sense of connection gave dignity to work that might otherwise feel endless. In the cooling hours of evening, as shadows stretched across courtyards, families gathered to share food and stories. These were not just tales meant to entertain children. They were bridges across time, reminding everyone that the challenges they faced, floods, illness, hardship, were part of a larger pattern. A father might recount the tale of how Enki saved humanity by finding a loophole in divine decrees. A grandmother might tell of how Inanna, though stripped of all her ornaments, returned from the underworld with courage and cunning. These woven narratives reassured listeners that survival was not only possible but expected of them. Every hardship had its metaphor in a story, and every victory mirrored some ancient triumph. In this way, myth became a living lens for interpreting each day. Inside the temples, the beating heart of the cities, rituals preserved the fragile balance between order and chaos. Priests moved with practiced precision, lighting lamps, pouring libations, reciting lines memorized across decades. The temple was no mere monument. It was a machine built to maintain cosmic symmetry. Every offering, every chant, every ceremonial gesture aligned the human world with the divine rhythm. If a ritual was performed poorly, if incense burned at the wrong hour, or a symbol was drawn incorrectly, priests feared that cracks might open in the harmony sustaining the city. This belief infused their work with a kind of sacred professionalism. They were caretakers of the universe, custodians of a fragile equilibrium. Yet outside the temple courts, political life could be as turbulent as the rivers. Kings ruled with grandeur, but also with vulnerability. A ruler's authority depended not only on military strength, but on his perceived relationship with the divine court. If a drought struck or an invasion succeeded, whispers spread through marketplaces and homes. Had the king offended the gods? Was the divine council withdrawing its favor? These murmurs carried weight. A ruler who ignored them risked insurrection or abandonment. Therefore, ancient kings often described themselves not as absolute masters but as chosen agents of divine order. They boasted of restoring temples, delivering justice, repairing canals, acts that aligned human governance with cosmic expectation. It was understood that no throne could stand without the approval of the unseen judges who set destinies. This interplay between politics and religion shaped diplomacy as well. When two cities forged a treaty, the agreement named not only human witnesses but also divine ones. Even enemies respected these oaths, knowing that a broken treaty offended powers far more dangerous than armies. The idea that justice had cosmic weight created a political climate where words and symbols mattered as deeply as swords. A treaty sealed with the names of the Anunnaki carried a sense of permanence that could survive generations, long after the kings who wrote it had turned to dust. Death, too, remained anchored in this worldview. When someone died, families lamented loudly, letting grief fill the air so the community could share it. But beneath the sorrow lay structure. They prepared the dead with reverence, placing lamps, bowls, and small comforts beside the body as if sending a traveler on a long journey. After burial, monthly rites ensured the spirit did not wander hungry or forgotten. These rituals reinforced a profound belief. Death was not disappearance, but transition into another realm governed by the same cosmic laws that shaped life. The underworld was not imagined as a punishment, but as a domain where the dead waited under the watchful eyes of the same high council that once set destinies above. In caring for the dead, the living honored the continuity of existence. Meanwhile, in workshops and homes, the arts flourished. Craftsmen believed their skill came from divine patronage. The potter shaping clay felt guided by Enki's wisdom, The weaver threading loom ropes honored Ninhursag's gift of creativity. Even the brewer stirring beer sang quiet hymns of gratitude. Art was not merely expression, it was collaboration with the divine. Cylinder seals carved with intricate images were personal signatures, tokens of identity, but also miniature cosmic scenes, reminding users that their daily transactions flowed within a universe watched by higher powers. Through art, ordinary people engaged in sacred storytelling. The natural world played its part in this spiritual ecology. Storms rolling across open plains were reminders of divine presence. Unexpected winds were interpreted as messages. A rainbow after rainfall carried meaning beyond spectacle. When the Euphrates or Tigris swelled with seasonal intensity, people saw not only hydrological cycles, but a reenactment of ancient battles between order and chaos. Nature was not a backdrop. It was a participant in myth. Every gust, every sunrise, every flood was folded back into a narrative that helped people interpret their place in creation. Even suffering, which might have seemed arbitrary in a harsh land, found a place in the cosmic arrangement. People believed misfortunes were signals, not punishments. A bad harvest meant something needed correction, perhaps a neglected ritual, a broken oath, or a lapse in communal cooperation. This perspective encouraged resilience rather than despair. If suffering meant something could be mended, then there was always hope. And hope, in a world where storms and invaders and disease threatened constantly, was not a luxury. It was a necessity. With every generation, the myths shifted slightly but retained their core. Scribes updated the language, priests adjusted the rituals, kings reinterpreted their divine mandates. But the underlying framework, the belief in cosmic order with human responsibility, remained steady. This continuity was the secret strength of Mesopotamian civilization. Other cultures rose and fell, lost in the chaos of their own uncertainties. Mesopotamia endured for millennia because its people believed that the universe itself supported their efforts to rebuild after every disaster. As these ideas spread abroad, carried by traders, priests, captives, and soldiers, they influenced neighboring religions and philosophies. The notion of a council of gods appeared in Canaanite and Hittite traditions. The concept of a single high authority presiding over creation influenced later monotheistic thought. The idea of written destinies traveled into mythologies far beyond the region. Even when the names changed, from Enlil to Baal, from Inanna to Astarte, the structure remained recognizable. The ancient stories acted like seeds carried by wind across centuries, taking root wherever the soil of human need was fertile. By the time these myths reached the modern world through archaeology and scholarship, they carried not only historical importance, but emotional resonance. Modern readers recognize themselves in the worries and hopes of ancient people, the longing for justice, the fear of chaos, the rituals of remembrance, the search for meaning. These were not relics of a vanished age, but reflections of universal human experience. The old stories survived because they spoke truths deeper than their symbols. Through all this, the Anunnaki remained the central thread of meaning, a symbol of divine deliberation, of cosmic law, of continuity between the living and the dead. They were not merely gods in stories, but embodiments of humanity's oldest questions. Who decides our fate? How do we live justly? What protects us from disorder? How do we honor those who came before? These questions, carried across thousands of years, still echo because they belong not just to Mesopotamia, but to the human condition, and the worldview that first gave them shape, the worldview of temples, courts, canals, festivals, and cosmic councils, still stands quietly behind much of the modern imagination, a reminder that civilization began not with conquest, but with the desire to place meaning between earth and sky. As the ancient worldview deepened, the connection between memory and identity became one of the strongest threads holding Mesopotamian culture together. People understood instinctively that forgetting was a form of death, and remembering was a form of life. Every ritual, every carved inscription, every whispered prayer served as a small act of defiance against time. A family's lineage was not merely a list of ancestors. It was a living chain that bound the present to the past. When someone recited the names of those who came before, they believed the dead stirred faintly, warmed by recognition. This belief shaped the attention people gave to their histories. Even ordinary households kept stories alive through repetition, ensuring that the achievements and failures of earlier generations remained guideposts for the living. Memory was a sacred duty, not only to honor those gone, but to safeguard the future. This reverence for continuity also penetrated the legal and economic fabric of Mesopotamian life. Clay tablets recording debt, land rights, and temple offerings were not seen as mundane paperwork. They were the backbone of trust in a world vulnerable to sudden disaster. A single tablet could outlast the lifespan of every person mentioned on it, standing as an impartial witness across generations. Its presence meant that agreements could survive beyond the lives of the parties who made them. This durability gave people confidence to build, trade, and take risks. In a landscape where rivers could shift unexpectedly, or a rival city could rise overnight, the permanence of clay offered stability. People wrote their promises into the earth itself, so that even when storms, wars, or upheavals came, the foundational truths of their society remained intact. Over time, this deep relationship with written memory evolved into a sophisticated scribal tradition. Learning to write was a privilege, reserved for those with patience, discipline, and often a family tradition of education. In schoolrooms where boys sat cross-legged on the packed earth, the sound of styluses clicking against clay created a kind of rhythm. Teachers drilled them endlessly in lists: animals, plants, words, gods, professions, measurements, because to write in Mesopotamia was not simply to copy symbols, but to master the shape of the world. Scribes became the true archivists of civilization, capable of retrieving the knowledge of centuries and transforming it into new forms. They preserved sacred hymns, copied royal annals, and documented trade. In doing so, they became mediators between eras, ensuring that nothing essential was lost. This profound respect for order permeated the moral imagination of Mesopotamia. People believed that the universe itself depended on balance, and they tried to reflect this ideal in their own behavior. They accepted that wrongdoing disturbed the equilibrium of cosmic life, just as neglecting a canal allowed fields to flood. A single broken oath could ripple outward, creating consequences that affected families, neighbors, and even strangers who had not yet been born. This interconnectedness made ethical behavior not merely a private choice, but a public necessity. People lived with the awareness that their actions echoed across the social fabric, reinforcing or weakening the bonds that held their communities together. The same sense of cosmic balance shaped their attitudes toward nature. Seasonal rhythms were not viewed as impersonal cycles, but as the movement of divine intention through the world. When river waters rose too high, it was not merely a natural event. It was a reminder of the delicate arrangement between human ambition and the land's limits. When rains arrived on time, gratitude filled fields and courtyards. This gratitude took shape through offerings, songs, and small gestures that acknowledged the unseen forces sustaining daily life. Even the quiet labor of pulling weeds or patching a roof became part of a larger covenant between humans and the divine landscape they inhabited. These beliefs influenced the way people talked about fate. Fate was not an unchangeable sentence, delivered in silence. It was something spoken, declared, made official in a ritual language that tied cosmic will to human responsibility. Fate could be severe, but it was transparent. It came through omens, dreams, ceremonies, and shared interpretation. Communities did not sit helpless before it. They prepared, adjusted, and sought advice. Priests read the signs, rulers consulted diviners, and families debated portents by firelight. Fate became less a mysterious doom and more a framework for thoughtful action. People believed they could navigate the currents of destiny with wisdom, humility, and patience. This philosophical orientation shaped even the architecture of their cities. Temples, palaces, and ziggurats rose with purpose, their lines and angles expressing a desire to align human structures with divine harmony. Inside these monumental buildings, the air was cool, the floors smoothed by countless footsteps, and the walls held the imprint of rituals repeated for generations. Standing in these spaces, people sensed a continuity between the physical and the spiritual. Each building was both a sanctuary and a symbol, a fusion of belief, discipline, and engineering. These structures were not built for spectacle alone. They embodied a philosophy that valued endurance over luxury, clarity over excess. Even after millennia of storms and erosion, the ruins still carry the presence of a people who understood the fragility of life yet built with deliberate care. The emotional landscape of Mesopotamian life also found expression in festivals and public gatherings. These events united entire communities in celebration, reflection, and renewal. Songs echoed through plazas. Dancers reenacted ancient myths, and offerings filled temple courtyards with fragrant smoke. Children learned the stories they would one day pass on. Elders watched traditions kept alive through the enthusiasm of youth. In these communal moments, people felt the full weight and warmth of belonging. Festivals allowed them to step outside daily hardships and remember that they were part of a larger, ongoing story. The joy, laughter, and reverence woven into these occasions sustained the courage needed to face unpredictable seasons and political uncertainties. Through all these layers of life, family, community, law, ritual, memory, one theme persisted: the belief that humans were part of a larger design that required participation, not passivity. People were expected to uphold order, care for the land, respect boundaries, honor the dead, and preserve knowledge. They believed these responsibilities maintained the world's equilibrium. This worldview was neither naive nor fatalistic. It acknowledged the harshness of reality while offering tools for endurance and meaning. In this balance between acceptance and action, the Mesopotamians left a legacy that still resonates. The long story of the Anunnaki was not, at its core, about divine beings ruling from unreachable heights. It was about a civilization searching for stability in a world shaped by unpredictable rivers, ambitious rulers, and the fragile lives of ordinary people. Their myths taught them that the universe favored balance and justice, that work mattered, that memory guided the living, and that even grief could be woven into order. These lessons, carried in clay, echoed in temples, and lived in homes, became the foundation of a worldview that endured for thousands of years and still stands as one of humanity's earliest attempts to build meaning out of uncertainty. As the centuries unfolded across Mesopotamia's shifting horizons, the relationship between human intention and cosmic expectation became even more intricately layered. People came to believe that their world functioned like a great woven tapestry. Every thread mattered, every strand connected to the next, and every choice subtly pulled at the larger fabric. This belief created a society in which even the simplest gestures carried significance. A merchant placing a seal on a tablet, a mother whispering a blessing over her child, a farmer choosing when to plow. All were seen as actions with echoes beyond the immediate moment. Life, in this sense, was both fragile and profound, shaped by human decision but framed by divine law. In the dim morning light, as cities stirred awake, the sounds of everyday tasks filled narrow streets. Clay jars rolled gently as water carriers moved through neighborhoods. Bakers tended their ovens while smoke curled into the sky. The scent of wet earth, incense, and fresh bread mingled in courtyards. These ordinary scenes grounded people in a sense of purpose. Every profession, whether scribe, potter, shepherd, or sailor, felt tied to cosmic order. When a potter shaped a vessel, he imagined his hands guided by divine creativity. When a scribe listed grain rations, he believed he was helping maintain the balance between want and plenty. Through this blending of the sacred and the mundane, people found dignity in work that might otherwise feel monotonous or exhausting. Beyond city walls stretched farmlands, where labor was inseparable from nature's rhythms. Farmers rose with the sun, pausing to read the sky before attending to their fields. The brightness of clouds, the hum of insects, the subtle change in wind direction, these were hints and messages written by the natural world, which Mesopotamians interpreted as part of the gods' communication. This attentiveness kept them alert, adaptable, and deeply connected to their environment. They worked with an awareness that their success depended on understanding the signs woven into each season. Cooperation with natural patterns was the quiet wisdom that sustained life generation after generation. In the civic arena, justice continued to be a living, breathing ideal. The marketplace, the temple courtyard, and the palace hall could all become stages where fairness was tested. People knew that disputes were inevitable, but they trusted that the divine order demanded clarity and equity. When two neighbors argued over a field boundary or a merchant claimed he had been cheated, witnesses gathered, oaths were sworn, and scribes recorded proceedings. This insistence on documentation distinguished Mesopotamian justice from systems grounded only in memory or verbal agreement. Written law provided a shield for the vulnerable, ensuring that their claims could not simply be erased by a powerful opponent. Even when decisions were complicated, the idea of accountability held firm. Every judgment echoed the cosmic responsibility of the gods. The emotional weight of justice extended into family life. Parents taught children that generosity and truthfulness were not optional virtues, but necessary foundations for living well. Stories of divine retribution and divine mercy illustrated the consequences of moral choices. A child might hear about a god who punished greed, but also about a deity who spared a humble farmer after he confessed a mistake. These contrasting stories emphasized that morality was not rigid but relational, shaped by context, intention, and humility. Such lessons became part of the emotional education that guided young people throughout their lives. Kingship itself continued to evolve, shaped by political pressures, shifting alliances, and the changing needs of the people. Rulers who ignored the expectations of fairness or devotion to public works found themselves facing not only human backlash, but theological consequences. Priests could interpret disasters, whether disease, famine, or military defeat, as signs of divine displeasure. This interpretive power acted as a subtle check against tyranny. Kings had to show that they served the gods and the people alike, building and repairing temples, sponsoring festivals, and ensuring that canals remained functional. These acts were not merely displays of wealth or authority, but services to the cosmic order that legitimized their rule. Festivals and rituals remained central to community cohesion. At specific times of the year, entire cities transformed into vibrant stages of celebration. Musicians played harps, drums, and flutes. Dancers moved in patterns learned from generations past. Priests carried statues of gods through crowded streets. Children clapped along to rhythms older than memory. These ceremonies renewed the sense of connection between humans and the divine realm. People believed that through these collective acts, the boundary between heaven and earth briefly softened, allowing guidance, protection, and blessing to flow more freely. The emotional power of these festivals strengthened bonds between neighbors, reaffirmed communal values, and reignited the hope that sustained the city through hardships. Even in silence, spirituality was present. Many people prayed alone, speaking softly in their homes or at small altars tucked into corners. These private moments built a personal connection to the gods that complemented public rituals. A merchant might ask for protection before a journey. A new mother might pray for her child's health. An elderly man might whisper thanks for surviving another year. These intimate acts kept faith grounded in daily life. They also reminded individuals that their concerns mattered, even when no priest or crowd witnessed their offering. Travelers moving between distant towns helped spread ideas, stories, and innovations. Caravan routes became pathways for cultural exchange. A foreign merchant might bring a new style of pottery, but he also carried tales of gods worshipped in distant lands. Mesopotamians listened with curiosity, comparing foreign myths with their own. This openness to different perspectives enriched their understanding of the world. It also strengthened the conviction that different cultures, though shaped by distinct geographies and histories, wrestled with the same essential questions. What is justice? What happens after death? What keeps the world from tipping into chaos? In these shared inquiries, people found a sense of kinship with strangers. As cities expanded and populations grew, the need for efficient governance increased. Officials monitored markets, maintained records, organized labor crews, and mediated disputes. Their work helped translate the ideals of cosmic order into practical administration. They were expected to act with integrity not because of fear alone, but because their actions represented the values of the gods they served. A dishonest official risked not only social disgrace but cosmic imbalance, a much heavier consequence in the public imagination. This belief system encouraged citizens to hold their leaders accountable, nurturing a political culture that valued transparency and fairness even within a hierarchical society. Trade, too, carried its own spiritual dimension. Merchants often attributed success not solely to skill or luck, but to divine favor. Before long journeys, they visited temples to seek blessings for safe passage and profitable exchange. When they returned with goods from distant regions, stone from Anatolia, metals from the mountains, textiles from the east, they offered a portion to the gods as a way of acknowledging their role in the venture. This ritualistic framing of commerce provided emotional reassurance in a world where travel was dangerous and markets unpredictable. Across all these experiences, the presence of death remained a quiet undercurrent, reminding people of the limits placed on every human life. Yet this awareness did not breed despair. It inspired intentional living. People aimed to leave behind good memories, fair dealings, and a legacy of contributions. They believed that after death they would be judged not by grand achievements alone, but by the honesty of their actions and the care they extended to others. The afterlife might have been dim, but it was shaped by the echoes of one's earthly behavior. This belief encouraged kindness, foresight, and communal responsibility. Ultimately, the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia cultivated a profound respect for continuity of land, memory, justice, and relationship. Even as dynasties rose and fell, even as storms reshaped landscapes and wars redrew borders, people held on to the conviction that order could always be rebuilt. Their myths were not static relics. They were living tools that provided emotional grounding and practical guidance. Through stories of gods who deliberated destinies, humans learned to deliberate their own choices carefully. Through tales of cosmic balance, they learned to maintain balance in their homes and communities. And so, across thousands of years, the people of the Tigris and Euphrates left behind more than bricks and tablets. They left a way of thinking, a way of living, that recognized the fragile beauty of existence and the enduring strength found in cooperation, memory, and shared belief. Their legacy invites us to see the world not as a place of chaos, but as a space where meaning can be created through responsibility, reverence, and connection. As the world of the first cities continued to evolve, so did the emotional and intellectual depth with which people interpreted their existence. Life in ancient Mesopotamia was never static. It moved like the rivers that nourished the lands, sometimes calm, sometimes unpredictable, always shaping the communities that relied upon them. Through each rise and fall, the people deepened their understanding of themselves, of their place in the cosmos, and of the fragile networks that held their world together. At the heart of this growing awareness was an increasing sense of interconnectedness. Every decision by a king, a priest, a merchant, or a simple farmer was believed to ripple outward in ways both visible and hidden. When a leader made a vow, the entire kingdom felt its impact. When a worker neglected a task, a canal could clog, a crop could fail, and a market could suffer. This interwoven system of mutual dependence taught people humility and responsibility. They knew that survival depended not on individual glory alone, but on the effort shared by all. Families became the first schools of moral conduct. Parents instilled in their children lessons shaped by generations of experience. Honor your agreements, respect your elders, work with diligence, and speak truth, even when it is hard. These lessons were not delivered with philosophical abstraction. They were tied to real stories, A child might hear how a dishonest measure in the marketplace once brought ruin to a household, or how a neighbor's generosity during a harsh winter preserved an entire street from hunger. Through such tales, morality took on a vivid, practical form. Meanwhile, cities grew into hubs of learning. Knowledge, once confined to temple courtyards, expanded into scribal schools, where eager minds trained to master the complex, wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform script. These schools demanded discipline and patience. Students copied lines again and again, their hands cramping as they etched neat impressions into damp clay. They memorized not only vocabulary but entire legal codes, hymns, and lists of professions. By the time they graduated, they had become guardians of cultural memory. Scribes were respected not for physical strength or military skill, but for their ability to preserve the words that shaped society. The cities themselves echoed with this intellectual energy. Market squares bustled with conversations about trade, politics, and omens. Travelers brought news from distant lands, strange customs, foreign gods, unusual markets. Priests interpreted celestial signs, guiding leaders on when to wage war, when to plant seeds, and when to hold back. Over time, these interpretations formed a system that encouraged people to weigh choices carefully, rather than rush into matters blindly. The idea that the cosmos offered clues became a core part of decision-making. But with growth came conflict. Cities competed over fertile land, water rights, and trade routes. Armies marched under banners that invoked the gods, each side believing it held divine favor. Yet even in war, boundaries existed. Before campaigns, leaders consulted priests and made solemn vows to spare certain sanctuaries. The presence of rules, even in violence, showed how deeply the idea of cosmic order shaped behavior. War was not simply chaos. It was a temporary disruption that had to be restored with ceremony and restitution. When conflict ended, societies turned back to rebuilding. Workers repaired damaged canals. Families mourned the fallen, and rulers offered gifts to the temples seeking forgiveness and renewed stability. These cycles of destruction and renewal taught the people resilience. They understood that even the most devastating events could be met with effort and hope. Festivals after difficult seasons served to heal emotional wounds and restore trust between citizens who'd suffered together. A profound emotional weight was carried in how Mesopotamians approached memory. The past was not something distant, it lived alongside the present. Families kept names of ancestors alive through ritual offerings. Cities preserved histories in tablets stored safely within temple rooms. Leaders celebrated ancient victories to remind people that hardship could always be overcome. Memory was a tool for grounding identity, guiding decisions, and strengthening unity. The belief in the afterlife also shaped this emotional landscape. Although the underworld was imagined as a dim and shadowed place, the rituals surrounding death were tender and deliberate. Families poured drinks, brought bread, and spoke aloud the names of their dead so they would not feel forgotten. These acts did not promise bliss. They promised remembrance. The emotional comfort this offered cannot be overstated. Even the simplest offering affirmed that relationships continued beyond the final breath. This gave life weight and meaning. People strove to act honorably because they believed their deeds echoed into a realm where truth still mattered. Political life expanded alongside spiritual life. Kings increasingly presented themselves not merely as rulers but as caretakers of cosmic balance. Their titles reflected responsibility rather than unchecked power. A king who rebuilt a city wall or restored a neglected temple earned genuine admiration. But a king who abused his authority risked divine punishment as much as public anger. Priests and scribes, through rituals, omens, and written decrees, became the moral compass of the state, ensuring that rulers did not drift too far from the principles that held society together. Even small communities played their role in this evolving vision of order. Villages on the fringes of large cities contributed grain, livestock, and labor. In return, they received protection, festival participation, and access to trade networks. This mutual exchange created a sense of belonging. People felt part of something larger, an interconnected world governed not only by earthly laws but also by the divine structure that the stories of the Anunnaki represented. Across workshops and granaries, across fields and courtrooms, the awareness of cosmic order shaped behavior in subtle yet powerful ways. Craftsmen aimed for perfection not to impress customers but to honor the gods who watched over their skill. Shepherds cared for flocks with tenderness because they believed the gods appreciated good stewardship. Merchants negotiated fairly to maintain their reputation and avoid invoking divine displeasure. Every action, from the smallest task to the grandest undertaking, held spiritual weight. The emotional heart of this worldview lay in its equilibrium between fear and comfort. People feared drought, illness, invasion, and the unpredictable moods of the rivers. But they found comfort in the belief that they were not alone, that their world was overseen by forces that valued justice, honesty, and balance. Through myth, ritual, law, and daily practice, they shaped a civilization that responded to unpredictability with structure, to hardship with cooperation, and to change with adaptability. This emotional architecture, layered over centuries, gave rise to a society that was both practical and profound. Their myths taught wisdom, their laws enforced fairness, and their rituals offered solace. Through these efforts, they created a blueprint for living that continues to inspire modern minds. The enduring legacy of Mesopotamia lies not in its vanished empires, but in its philosophy of connection between people, between past and present, and between the earthly and the divine. As we reach the final movement of this long journey, the story begins to shift from the cities themselves to the wider landscape that gave birth to their ideas. The world of the first civilizations was shaped not only by people and gods, but by the land under their feet, the rivers that carved their borders, and the sky that kept time with its patient turning. In this closing part, the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual threads of the narrative pull together into a single continuous reflection on what the Anunnaki meant, not as aliens, not as fiction, but as the architecture of meaning in a world learning to understand itself. The land of the lower rivers was never gentle. It was a place where life clung to narrow bands of fertile soil, bordered by wide and unforgiving stretches of marsh and desert. The people who lived there knew intimately that survival required attention, cooperation, and ritual. Every canal dug was a negotiation with the river. Every harvest was a gamble. Yet it was in this precarious environment that humanity first dared to build cities and call them homes. The fragility of the land made its inhabitants practical, but it also made them dreamers. They looked at the sky not just for omens, but for reassurance that they were part of a larger ordered system. In this environment, the myths of the Anunnaki were not escapist fantasies. They were frameworks for interpreting real challenges, The separation of sky and earth gave a sense of structure to a world that often felt chaotic. The council that set destinies mirrored the councils of elders and judges in real cities, offering a cosmic example of fairness and accountability. The flood story taught that even devastating loss had precedent, meaning, and a way forward. People learned that the world resets, but also rebuilds, that destruction can be understood and therefore endured. The creation of humans from clay mixed with divine essence carried an emotional truth that transcended its imagery. It told people that labor was not a punishment, but a shared agreement between mortals and the divine. This idea softened the weight of toil. A canal worker deep in mud could imagine himself fulfilling a role written long before his birth. A priest preparing offerings could feel part of a chain that stretched back to the beginning of memory. The connection between humans and gods was made tangible, not through fear alone, but through shared purpose. As the centuries passed, these stories traveled. They moved through trade routes, across mountains, along rivers, and into new lands. Conquerors borrowed stories to legitimize their rule. Migrants carried tales to their new homes. Scribes adapted myths to fit new languages and changing political landscapes. Yet the core remained: the need for order, the assurance of justice, the acknowledgement of limits, and the recognition that work and memory bind communities together. The Anunnaki evolved from local deities into symbols of cosmic structure, their stories expanding in meaning even as their original temples fell into ruin. What is striking is how seamlessly these ideas blended with new cultures. When the Hebrews wrote their own flood story, they carried forward the emotional truth of living in a flood-prone world. When the Hittites, and later the Assyrians, adopted the concept of elder gods, confined below by a younger generation, they preserved the sense of generational struggle and transition that shaped Mesopotamian thought. Babylon transformed an older pantheon into something newly systematic, giving Marduk the authority to arrange the heavens in an order that could be measured and predicted. Each adaptation shows not mere imitation, but genuine engagement with the foundational ideas. Yet through all these transformations, the heart of the mythology remained grounded. Ziggurats, towering yet built brick by brick, served as reminders that the cosmos was reachable through human effort. These structures were not merely monuments, they were living diagrams of the universe, linking earth, atmosphere, and the realm of the gods in one vertical gesture. Standing upon one, a person could look out over canals, markets, fields, and city walls, feeling the simultaneous weight of responsibility and the uplift of belonging to something far beyond their own life. The rituals that accompanied these beliefs were equally practical. The recitation of hymns kept memory alive. The pouring of beer for ancestors honored continuity. The inspection of skies and animal signs kept people attentive to patterns in nature. Every ritual was a lesson wrapped in symbolism. Pay attention, honor your obligations, act with care, and remember that the world is bigger than your immediate needs. Even the darkest elements of myth, journeys to the underworld, curses on boundary stones, were ultimately guides to living ethically in the present. As time moved forward and empires rose and collapsed, the myths of the Anunnaki acquired new layers of meaning. Modern interpreters, sometimes grasping for wonder, sometimes for certainty, projected fresh anxieties onto these ancient stories. The Anunnaki became aliens, overlords, or cosmic engineers in the imaginations of contemporary writers. These retellings reveal something not about the ancient world, but about our own: a desire for significance, a fear of being ordinary, and a hope that we are part of a grander tale. Yet even these modern reinventions cannot erase the deeper truth embedded in the clay tablets, because the power of the Anunnaki story has never depended on spectacle. It has always depended on honesty, the honesty of acknowledging human limits, the honesty of admitting that work is necessary and often difficult, the honesty of recognizing that justice must be spoken and recorded, the honesty of saying that death is not a doorway to paradise, but a continuation of connection maintained through ritual and remembrance. This grounded, unromantic view of the universe is what allowed the myths to endure. They offer a way to live, not a way to escape. In this final reflection, one sees clearly that the Anunnaki were never meant to be distant, unreachable beings. They were woven into the daily life of cities and homes, into laws and festivals, into grief and celebration. Their presence reminded people that every action, whether building a wall, signing a tablet, or comforting a neighbor, mattered in a world that watched and remembered. They represented the belief that the universe, for all its unpredictability, was not indifferent. It responded to order, to effort, to truth spoken aloud. When we look back now, walking through museums or scanning images of ancient ruins, we witness more than architecture or artifacts. We see a record of how humanity first learned to make meaning, how it first confronted the overwhelming scale of existence and responded with structure and story. The teachings embedded in the myths still resonate because they address universal human concerns: how to work together, how to create fairness, how to honor the dead, how to endure loss, how to navigate uncertainty, and how to find dignity in labor. By the time we reach the end of this long narrative, the Anunnaki are no longer distant figures from a remote myth. They become companions in our understanding of human striving. Their stories illuminate the fragile balance between order and chaos, between tradition and change, between fear and hope. They remind us that civilizations rise not only on bricks and grain, but on shared beliefs about what matters, what is sacred, and what must be protected. And as we imagine those original cities, the hum of markets, the shadows of ziggurats, the sound of styluses pressing into wet clay, we can appreciate how these myths were never only about gods. They were about the people who shaped them, who whispered them to children, who waited for signs in the sky, who dug canals under the heat of the sun, who dreamed of justice, and who sought comfort in stories that promised meaning even in hardship. This is the final gift of the Anunnaki legacy: the reassurance that meaning is something we build, preserve, and pass down, just like the clay tablets that survived fire, flood, and time. And as long as we continue to read, question, and remember, the ancient voices will never fall silent. If you've walked with us through this long journey, across ruined cities, silent tablets, forgotten gods, and the oldest questions ever asked, then let this be our final invitation. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, or simply kept you company in the quiet hours, feel free to support this work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these ancient voices travel a little farther, and it allows us to continue bringing you stories from the deep past, told with care, patience, and respect. And if you wish to join us again, you're always welcome to return. The next journey is already waiting.